Well, good afternoon. It's Glenn Withers from Virginia Opera. It's glad to be back with you here in the studios of WHRO to talk about the forthcoming production of Wagner's The Valkyrie. We're giving it an English title, although we do sing it in German, as Wagner would have wished, because that's our way of cueing you and letting you know that this is an abridged version. We're cutting some of the soybean meal out of this operatic hamburger. And let's talk about Wagner. Yes, we're talking about Wagner. No, don't touch that dial. Stop it. Don't go over to 89.5. Stay right here on 90.3. Those of you I know, the moment the name Wagner comes up, you have a visceral reaction of repulsion. I know. I get it. There is no more polarizing composer in all of classical music, and certainly in opera, than Richard Wagner. He's kind of the New York Yankees of opera. You know how people are with the Yankees? Either you think they're ruining all sports and they should be broken up and terrible, they buy all their players, or else you root passionately for them. Nobody's neutral about the Yankees, and nobody is neutral about the operas of Wagner. So for those of you who would really rather we were doing Bellini's Norma with nice melodies, tunes that have a beginning and a middle and an end, rather than Wagner, what I want to do this afternoon is give you my take on this opera, The Valkyrie, the second leg of this immense music drama, The Ring of the Nibelung. And I want to give you some tools for appreciating it. You can't dislike it for not being La Traviata. You have to appreciate the merit that it does have. It's sort of like with food. You can't blame Brussels sprouts for not being Linzertort. There are different kinds of food, and, you know, I'm a pig. I'm a glutton. I like most kinds of foods, and I like most kinds of music. I want to share with you what makes Wagner special so that you can come to it on its own terms. I've got some quotes about this composer to get us off to the races. And think about these. George Marek was at one time the head of RCA Records' classical division, and he was also a biographer of Beethoven, Richard Strauss, Mendelssohn, and Puccini. And he was once quoted as saying in an essay he wrote about German opera that the trouble with German opera is that in terms of musical inspiration, it's equal parts ambrosia and pretzels. That you find two kinds of music. You find music that's so beautiful and ecstatic that it lifts you out of your seat, and you also find a lot of wholesome German folk tunes and just a lot of recitative that goes on and on endlessly. And that the secret is to understand the nature of the ambrosia and to await it breathlessly. I can also quote from Woody Allen. A joke he told at the end of his award-winning film Annie Hall, where he's summing up his relationship with Diane Keaton. And he said that there was a guy who went into a psychiatrist and said, Doc, I got a problem. My brother thinks he's a chicken. The psychiatrist says, oh, well, that's very serious. Have you turned him in to the authorities? And the guy says, well, I would, but you know what? I need the eggs. And Woody goes on to say that's kind of how it is with relationships. And I'm going to add parenthetically with Wagner's operas. They can drive you crazy. They can just make your liver itch. They can be dull. They can be challenging, and they can be awkward. But you know what? They deliver the eggs, and we all need those eggs. So we're going to find out what constitutes the eggs and the ambrosia. There's a meal menu for you. And we'll be looking at all sorts of things. We're going to take a look at some of the terminology that always arises when discussing Wagner. That term leitmotif. People talk about endless melody. There's a poetic term, Stabreim. We'll figure out what that is. And I will make the case for saying that actually you shouldn't think of Wagner's operas as operas at all, or even music dramas, to use one of his terms. I'm going to make the case that Wagner invented the movies. He wasn't writing operas at all. He was writing films. I think there's no doubt he would be a film maker if he lived today. But let's start with describing the problem. I know what you think of when you think of Wagner. You think of great big obese sopranos who tip the scales at about 412 pounds and have horns on their head and metallic breastplates and swords and spears and emit these blood-curdling shrieks at the top of their lungs, something like this. It makes your houseplants curl up and die, those clamoring high notes. It makes your Cocker Spaniel sterile so she can never have puppies. Why can't they make nice sounds? Well, they do. That, of course, was Brunhilde, the Valkyrie of the title. What is a Valkyrie? A Valkyrie is one of the warrior goddesses sired by our head god Wotan. The goddess's job is to roam the earth on battlefields, pick up the corpses of fallen heroes, and bring them up to the home of the gods up in the sky of Valhalla, where they will be reincarnated to serve basically on the security detail and protect Wotan's butt from invading monsters and rival gods and, I don't know, the Taliban, I suppose. They'll keep everybody safe. And that's about the last reference to the plot you'll get today. I really want to talk about the music. If you don't know the story of Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung, please Google it and look it up. We'll be here until dinner time and past if I tell you the story. Wagner's music, here's the thing. I think that we as Americans should be able to relate very well to what Wagner is trying to do. Wagner was dissatisfied with the state of opera in his lifetime. Who were the great opera composers? Mozart, Rossini, Donizetti, Bellini, Verdi, and some other minor figures that were popular then, but we don't pay too much attention to today, like Meyerbeer. Wagner had no use for those operas. He knew them very well. He made a living from time to time conducting opera in German opera houses. Wagner had all sorts of problems. He did not like the fact that music dramas were broken down into dialogue, which was sometimes sung as recitative, and musical numbers, arias. He did not like the aria. The problem with the aria was that it sort of chopped up the pace of the drama into little 3 and 4 minute segments, and it was interrupted for applause. And, of course, we're all familiar with the cult of the diva, the prima donna. He did not like the fact that the star singers were getting too much of the attention rather than the force of the drama itself. He did not like the type of poetry that was being used. With meter and rhyme. He thought that it was a kind of a trivial sort of poetry. He was looking for something different. And he also had a problem with the fact that so many operas told historical stories, stories of heroes of the immediate past, or stories that were set in a certain era of society. For instance, Verdi's La Traviata, which was set in contemporary times in mid-19th century Paris. Wagner had a theory about this. Wagner did not feel that the function of opera was to be entertainment. Think about that. Isn't that why most of you who are listening to me this afternoon go to the opera? Because it's one of your favorite forms of entertainment? It reminds me of an anecdote about George Friedrich Handel. After the first London performance of his great oratorio, Messiah, a British nobleman came up to Handel and said, "Well, I congratulate you on your splendid entertainment." Handel replied, "My lord, I should be disappointed if all I achieved was to entertain you. I wanted to make people better." Wagner felt that as long as you were just telling trivial love stories set in a particular era of society or history, that it was not going to have the function of that he had in mind. And what did Wagner want? Wagner felt that long ago, at the dawn of time, society was better. That in modern society, with its industrial revolution and with the gadgets and technology and materialism, that humankind had lost sight of true communal values, that at one time there were no class distinctions. Everybody was equal. And if you lived in an ancient community, you all worked together and shared what you had. And there was no wealthy and poor, noble and peasant, have and have not. Wagner wanted his music dramas to be a sort of an allegory for that perfect communal society that would strike a primordial note and resonate with his audience and help distract them from the ephemeral things of the times in which they lived. And the problem with an opera like La Traviata is that if you move it to a different historical period, 50 years, 100 years later, the values of society change, and the message of La Traviata is not as relevant. And, you can see that. There's a current production of La Traviata at the Metropolitan Opera, which has been updated, people in modern dress. And people have pointed out that the entire scandal of Violetta Valkyrie marrying a young man, and because of her past, her, sort of scandalous past, that would prevent her lover's sister from getting married because the scandal would be too great. Well, that couldn't happen in our day and time. It's difficult for us to relate to that sense of scandal and outrage. And this is Wagner's point. Wagner deliberately chose mythology because it is timeless. Wagner wanted to express what he called the purely human, something so intrinsic to the human experience. He wanted to distill human nature, human emotion, into something that would not change with the ephemeral fashions of society as we go from one generation to another. Now, as I was saying, I believe, so, by the way, of course, that's why he chose Old Norse mythology of Wotan and all those Norse gods and kind of blended it with the old Germanic legends of the hero Siegfried. I believe that we as Americans should be able to relate really well to the heroes in The Ring of the Nibelung. For instance, in the opera that we're going to be listening to today, the Valkyrie, the hero is Sigmund, who is half man, half god, Wotan's son, as it were, and he is supposed to be a hero to pave the way for the redemption of the gods and the return of the ring back to Wotan's possession. Here's the thing. I believe that this idea of a hero is something that is very much of our culture as well. Wotan wanted Siegmund and Siegfried to be a role model for Germans. He was, of course, quite nationalistic, quite jingoistic, if you will, about German culture. He chose Germanic myth because Wagner believed sincerely that the German culture, German values, German language, the German character were superior to others in Europe. Well, he's entitled. He's a good Saxon. He has that kind of faith in his culture. And he believes that the heroes of German mythology can be the best vehicle for representing the best of humankind. Now, there is a moment in the first act of Valkyrie, in which actually myths kind of intersect. There's a King Arthur moment when Sigmund is pulling a sword, an enchanted sword, not out of a stone like Arthur, but out of an ash tree in the home of his enemy Hunding. And I want you to listen to the passage in which Sigmund is calling upon this sword, which he has named Notung, and you'll hear his sister and lover, Sieglinde, scream in amazement and joy when he extracts it from the tree. And then you're going to hear some very dashing, very dramatic hero music. And listen especially to the orchestra, because there's a point I'll want to talk about on the other side. Here is as good a musical representation of a hero as you will ever find. What caught my attention is both in the orchestra part, when he's holding that sword high over his head and exulting in it, rhythms in both the orchestra and the vocal line. Bum, bum, ba-dum, da-dum. Dee-do-do-dee-do-dum, bum, ba-dum, ba-dum. That very heroic sounding music, that should strike a chord with us. Does it remind you a little bit of some of the film heroes in American film sagas? How about Indiana Jones? Dum da dum 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 da dum bum ba dum bum ba dum bum. That dotted rhythm, bum ba dum. In the Superman movies, both the recent Superman movies with Christopher Reeve, in which the theme was bum ba 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 bum 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 ba dum ta 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 dum bum ba dum. There it is, that little rhythmic note of long, short, long. And in fact, you go back to the old George Reeves Superman TV show. It had the very same rhythmic motive. So, think about Superman. Who is Superman? Superman is the last of his race. Up there on a planet of super beings, Krypton, he comes to Earth where he has magical powers and he fights for what? Truth, justice, and the American way. All right, who is Zygmunt? Zygmunt is the last of his race. Wotan came to Earth and sired a race of mortals with a mortal woman, and Zygmunt and Sieglinde are the only survivors of this race. Zygmunt, therefore, is getting his magical powers from the enchanted sword Notung, and he is now going to fight for truth, justice, and the Valhalla way. And Wagner doesn't mind if you infer from that the German way. It's very, very similar to our concept of a hero. Think about also some of the other film sagas. Now, of course, The Lord of the Rings, the movies based on J.R. Tolkien, come from the same source of ancient mythology, although Tolkien was not very interested in Wagner's Ring cycle. But I'm thinking about Star Wars. Who was Luke Skywalker? Luke Skywalker returns home one day to find that his home has been burnt by barbarians and that his family is dead or missing. He gets a magic lightsaber from a godlike being, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and he encounters a lovely maiden with whom he feels an instant attraction and kinship, only to find out later that it's actually his sister, the Princess Leia. Folks, do you see the connection? This is the story of Zygmunt as well. Zygmunt feels an attraction for Sieglinde, Hunding's wife, and comes to find out that actually she is his sister. And yes, they have a romantic relationship. I always feel that we shouldn't get too upset about that. In fact, I love the moment when Wotan is defending the amorous relationship of Zygmunt and Sieglinde to his wife, Fricka, who is the goddess of domesticity and marriage. Fricka says, "Who ever heard of a brother and sister falling in love?" And the literal translation of Wotan's reply is, "Well, you have now," which I think is wonderful. That's how Wagner dispenses with the whole issue. So, therefore, I think that Zygmunt is a hero that should strike a chord in us Americans. It's the kind of heroism that we've grown up with in our culture, from Paul Bunyan up to Luke Skywalker and Indiana Jones. Now, here's one of these terms that we want to come to grips with. I'm going to give you a little bit of a music theory lesson here. I hope it won't be too tedious. To me, this is interesting. We want to get used to Wagner's musical language because it's really different from that of Verdi, Puccini, and Rossini and our other Italian heroes of the opera. What does endless melody mean? Well, when you have a melody, as I referred to at the beginning of this program, you want a melody to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Here's a really short melody. Shave and a haircut, 2 bits. That 2 bits is what we music nerds call a cadence. Musical phrases, cadence, is a form of musical punctuation. If I just sang shave and a haircut and stopped right there, that would bother you because it doesn't sound complete. It lacks resolution. It's a little bit like you wanting to sneeze. You have the Well, you can't stop there. Everybody listening to the radio wants me to go chew to bring a sense of finality and resolution. That's what a cadence does. They're the chords which allow you to step on home plate, as it were, and such as shaving a haircut, 2 bits, brings that phrase to a conclusion. Now, Wagner was really wanted to avoid the whole phenomenon of the music being interrupted for applause. He wanted, just as life does not contain stoppages for bowing and applause, when you go to the grocery store, nobody stops and applauds for you. You just go on with your day. So I'm going to show you how Endless Melody works a little bit. I made some recordings at the keyboard of a phrase that Wotan sings to his daughter Brunhilde in the final scene. And it's a phrase in which another composer, a traditional composer, would have substituted any number of cadences. And I'm going to show you how Wagner avoids that. So here we go. Let's play the first one. This is me at the keyboard. And it's going to stop with a nice, satisfying cadence, except that's not how Wagner wrote it. Well, that was very tuneful and pretty, and it came to a nice final cadence. But actually, that's not what happens in Wagner. Let's listen to it again. We'll listen to the last couple of chords, and you'll see how he sidesteps that final chord and gives another one which forces us to go on to the next possible cadence. And there was another chew following the tension of the build-up, the ah. But once again, listen to how Wagner actually wrote that, giving a deceptive push to the harmony to force the phrase to keep going. Now, surely that's the end of the phrase, right? Finally, he let us step on home plate, didn't he? Well, no, he didn't. Let's hear how this actually keeps going to yet another sidestep. And we never, ever get to home plate. That sneeze never resolves. Here is Theo Adam singing that phrase now in the Carl Böhm recording, and listen to how it's beautiful and it's sumptuous harmony, but it never resolves. That's what we mean by endless melody, and I think it can take a little getting used to. If you're accustomed to the regular phrases and cadences of the Italian and the French school, it's a little bit like you feel disoriented. We like those punctuation. It's like a big run-on sentence. All I can tell you is it's a little like being in a darkened room. Your eyes have to adjust to a darkened room so you don't bump into the furniture. In listening to Wagner's melodic style, after a while, your ears adjust and you process the music in a different way and kind of give into it. Now, I mentioned a while ago that, for my money, Wagner did not write operas, or even to use his term, music dramas. He wrote movies. And what do I mean by this? When I think of what visual effects Wagner wanted, I know he was frustrated because he didn't have the amazing technology that's available to production teams today, such as the fabulous mechanical contraption that they've got on the Metropolitan Opera stage these days for their ring cycle. Things were pretty primitive in Wagner's day, but you think about the images he had in mind. Warrior goddesses on flying horses, swooping on a battlefield, converging on warriors, swarming around them with mighty magical stallions. These are images of cinematography, and the music is cinematic as well. Let's take a look at the most famous orchestral moment in all of opera, in my opinion, the Ride of the Valkyries, and notice how Wagner provides orally what he knew that he would not be able to achieve visually on the stage. You'll hear a swirling of clouds in the distance as the goddesses draw nearer on their savage mounts. Then you'll hear the darting, the swooping. You'll hear the giant horses flapping their arms. You'll hear it all in the music, as well as the galloping rhythm of the horses galloping in thin air. That is musical cinematography, as I like to call it. Now, if you ask the great film scorers, John Williams from our day or from a previous generation, someone like Max Steiner, and ask them the biggest influence on them, to a man, they will all say Richard Wagner. When you think of the Hollywood dramas of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, my friends, if it's not Richard Strauss, in most cases, it's Richard Wagner. Wagner's scoring for orchestra obviously has, for instance, think of a melodrama maybe from the 40s in which there is a hero who is flying to his beloved's side. Maybe she's in the hospital. Maybe he's found out that she is the mother of his child, and the child has just been born, and he has only moments until she passes away, and he's struggling, going through storm and wind to be at her side before it's too late. Think of a Hollywood melodrama like that. Wouldn't this be the music that might accompany it? This is from the top of Act 2 of Valkyrie. Pure Hollywood, that could be from Gone with the Wind or any movie from that generation. But the most compelling way in which Wagner invented the movies is in underscoring scenes with no dialogue. Now, who ever heard of an opera in which 2 or 3 or 4 minutes go by of action on the stage with no recitative and no singing and no vocal music whatsoever. And the funny thing about these scenes, when they happen in Wagner, when the orchestra is the only music that you're hearing, is when you read the stage directions, they're all about facial expressions and the eyes, what you can read in the eyes of the character, sympathy in the eyes, compassion in the eyes, contempt in the eyes. And, I always think to myself, well, if you're sitting in the rear of the balcony, in the last row of the balcony at the Harrison Opera House, how the heck can you read facial expressions? They're too far away. And that is a problem. I think Wagner would have loved to be able to do what Hollywood does, give you those gigantic close-ups of the face so that you can watch those actors emoting, all of the gamut of emotions, making puddles on the floor. I'll give you an example. Here is a scene from Act 1 of Valkyrie, and while the music is playing, I am going to be doing a voiceover of what the stage directions are saying. This is a scene in which Siegmund finds himself an unwilling guest in the home of his enemy, Hunding, who lives there with his wife, Sieglinde, who Siegmund has instantly fallen in love with. So here we go. We're going to hear about a couple of minutes or more of music in which nothing is spoken. This is a movie scene. Sieglinde stands for a long moment, undecided and thoughtful. Slowly she turns. With hesitating steps, she edges towards the storeroom. There she again pauses and remains standing, lost in thought, her face half averted. With quiet resolution, she opens the cupboard, fills a drinking horn, and shakes some spices into it from a box. She turns her gaze upon Siegmund. Her eyes meet his eyes, which he keeps unceasingly fixed on her. She then perceives Hunding watching them and turns immediately to the bedchamber. On the steps, she turns once more, looks yearningly at Siegmund, and indicates with her eyes, persistently and with eloquent earnestness, a spot in the ash tree's stem in which is lodged a sword. And there's the leitmotif of the sword. It goes on for another minute with similar stage directions about people glaring at each other or gazing yearningly at each other. And I'm sorry, but from the back row of the balcony, you basically got three fat people standing motionless, and you're waiting for them to start singing again. But what a difference it would be if it could be a movie shot with close-ups. So that's what I mean. Once you approach Wagner's operas as cinema, they make a lot more sense. That's what he's trying to do, the effects that we take for granted today. Next, we're going to investigate the poetry that is used, because this poetic style used by Wagner has a great deal to do with how the music sounds. Wagner did not care for the modern style of poetry with meter and with end rhymes, ta-dum, 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 so please hold me tight, ba-dum, ta-dum, 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 all through the night. For Wagner, this was trivial because it was too modern. It was the way all the other librettists were writing poetry. So to find something that would be more mythic and more timeless, he turned to a form of poetry called the Stabraim, which he found in the old Icelandic poetic sagas called the Edda. And the secret to Stabraim is that it is alliterative poetry. There is no end rhyme, and there's no particular meter. I've got some examples here. For instance, actually, you know where you find Stabraim? If you know My Fair Lady, you know Stabraim, because there's a moment where Alfred P. Doolittle says to Professor Henry Higgins, "I'd tell you, Governor, if you'd let me get a word in. I'm willing to tell you. I'm wanting to tell you. I'm waiting to tell you." Right there, that's alliterative verse. And when in Act 1, Siegmund and Sieglinde are declaring their love for one another, and Siegmund sings the closest that Wagner ever came to writing an aria, the great Winterstürme, in which he says, "The wintertime of your life is over. Fling open the doors and embrace the spring of your life." Here is the poetry. Winterstürme wichen dem Wonnemond. In milde Lichte leuchtete Lenz auf Linden liften leicht und lieblich. Wunderwebend sich wiegt. It almost doesn't matter what the words mean. The kind of reckless abandon with which those alliterative words happen in quick succession gives that rapturous quality that he's looking for. And so what does this produce but a type of melody in which there is not the sort of standard fixed meter that you find in bel canto opera. Here's a little bit of that Winterstürme sung by James King. And not only is it a more free-flowing kind of meterless meter, but that's a darn good tune as well. Those who say Wagner can't compose a melody, I know what you mean. It's not the same as bel canto melody, but that's a really nice tune. Cut the man some slack. Now, back to that idea of the ambrosia and the pretzels, of the chicken and the eggs. We like the ambrosia. We could do without the pretzels. Well, that's one reason that we at Virginia Opera are cutting out a good deal of material from Valkyrie. The trouble with Valkyrie is, as great an opus as The Ring of the Nibelung is, it is flawed. Let me say this about The Ring of the Nibelung. It is something that any educated person in Western culture should be acquainted with. It is the single greatest, most ambitious, most epic, most majestic single work of art that Western culture has yet produced. It's some 800 pages of libretto and stage direction, some 3,700 pages of music, calls for an orchestra of 120. You can do La Traviata with an orchestra of 35 to 40. Wagner wrote all of the four dramas, wrote the words, he composed the music. It took him some 3 decades of backbreaking work and fundraising. He designed and built the theater in which the first festival of the Ring of the Nibelung was performed. He stage directed the singers. He conducted the orchestra. It's as if one man had built the pyramids in Egypt. It's a staggering achievement. It's 15 hours of performance length, and it's all one contiguous music drama. You should not ignore it. You might adore it, you might be revolted by it, but you can't ignore it. You really have to become acquainted with it. And yes, it's flawed. These characters do talk too much. They really do. Wotan is kind of a gas bag sometimes, and we have it begs for a red pencil, and we have taken out some of his gassier moments to streamline the opera and give you as much of just the pure eggs and ambrosia as we can. But whence comes these stretches that some people don't appreciate? I'm going to give you there's a scene in the second act in which Wotan and Fricka are debating the morality of the union of the twins, Sigmund and Sieglinde. And, it's what we call recitative. It's accompanied recitative. It's fine. Listen to a little bit of this debate between husband and wife. Well, that's recitative. If you know very much about opera, you understand that recitative is dialogue that's set to music. It's sung. It's not a musical number. It's not an aria. But generally, in traditional operas, we sit through the recitative because we know that it's introducing us to the next great aria or musical number. The trouble with recitative in Wagner is that rather than go on for 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, it can be 10, 15, 20 minutes in length, and it palls. We grow a little weary of it. You might be interested to know my theory about where Wagner learned this style. It actually comes from Mozart, my friends, from Die Zauberflöte, the magic flute. As far as I can see, Mozart was the first to take this accompanied recitative and use it not just as an introduction to the following aria, but actually construct an entire scene out of accompanied recitative. I'm thinking of the scene between the speaker at Zarathustro's temple and Tamino. Now, if you're just a casual opera fan and you heard that, you might guess that it was Wagner. It is quite Wagnerian, and in that sense, Wagner is quite Mozartian when he sets dialogue the way he does. So that's how we account for the eggs. Here's how we get the ambrosia. Wagner delivers moments of bliss and ecstasy and rapture and spiritual transfiguration like no one else ever could. I've got just a couple of short examples for you here, and they're not going to have the same potency played out of context like this. When Wagner really delivers the goods in terms of an emotional connection through his music, it can leave you limp. It can leave you feeling emotionally spent. Here is the scene in which Brünnhilde explains to Sieglinde, who is mourning the loss of her husband, Siegmund, who's killed in battle, and she no longer wants to live. Brünnhilde says, "No, you must live because you are carrying your husband's child, and he will grow up to be the greatest hero the world has ever known, the mighty Siegfried." And the response, the overwhelming joy and thrill and rapture in the response of Sieglinde is not only one of Die Valkyrie's great moments, it's one of opera's great moments. And by the way, you may notice that when Brünnhilde finished her prediction, her prophecy of the birth of Siegfried, the music allowed us to step on home plate. It finished with a final cadence. That's what Wagner does. When he finally does resolve the harmony of a phrase, he does so at moments of great structural or dramatic importance, and they're all the more satisfying because you finally got to experience it. Oh, there's so many moments like this. We don't have time for all of them. Let me play you one more. Here is the moment when, what Valkyrie is about a father's anger and love for his disobedient daughter. Brünnhilde was bidden by Wotan to allow Siegmund to be killed in battle by Hunding. She tried to save him. She defied her father. He's furious with her. And the moment comes before she faces her inevitable punishment when she explains the reason that she disobeyed him. It was because, she says, she knew what he wanted in his heart. The compassion that he felt for Siegmund, that the father really wanted the son to be victorious in battle. It was his words said, "Let him die," but his heart said, "Let him live," and she was trying to follow his heart. And here is the extremely compelling music in which she explains that she was empathizing with that compassion. Very well. So many moments like that. There's just a wealth of ambrosia to be savored in this fabulous music drama. Now, you may have heard a recurring motive, a recurring musical idea. Dee dum dum da da da. Actually, that entire excerpt was made up of nothing but repetitions of the phrase dee da dum da da da. And now we get into the discussion with which I'll close today's program, a little bit of cluing you into what we mean by a leitmotif. A motive, friends, is simply a musical idea, either rhythmic or melodic, that is very short, compact, and easily recognizable. The most famous motive in music history is from Beethoven. Ba-ba-ba-bam. And he managed to construct an entire multi-movement symphony out of basically those four notes. Think of a melody as a wall and motives as the bricks which comprise that wall. And Wagner's music is famous for being basically a tapestry that is woven together of dozens and dozens of motives. Now, musicologists have come along and called them leitmotif, which means leading motive. It's a term Wagner never used. And take these with a grain of salt, because you know what? It's not like you have to have a scorecard or a little catalog of these in your hand as you come to our production of the Valkyrie at the Harrison Opera House and be constantly checking what you hear against the list in your hand. You know, the opening night audience at Bayreuth in the 1870s, they did not have any clue about this whole system of leitmotifs. They were expected to enjoy the music as much as it could be enjoyed. Wagner intended these motives to be understood intuitively, kind of like what they do in subliminal advertising in Madison Avenue. However, it is kind of cool to investigate these, and I've got some real quick examples for you just to show you not only what a motive is, but how Wagner sometimes uses it, just sticking our toe in the deep, deep ocean of these leading motives. A motive can stand for a person. Well, here's what we hear for the great barbaric enemy Hunding. And that's it. That's Hunding's motive. I always think that Prokofiev must have had this in mind when he wrote the motive for the big bad wolf in Peter and the Wolf. But anytime that Hunding is referred to or thought of or referenced in any way, you'll hear that in the orchestra in some version. Motive can stand for a place. For instance, here is the motive associated with the home of the gods, Valhalla. Now, it's a little subtle how these motives are used in Wagner's operas. For instance, the first time we hear it in Die Valkyrie is when Sieglinde is explaining to Siegmund how that sword came to be stuck in that ash tree. She says, well, one day an old man with his hat covering half of his face shuffled in, and with one mighty blow he stuck that sword in the tree. Well, she never says that it's Wotan. There's nothing in the libretto to give us a clue that she's talking about Wotan in disguise. But here's what you hear in the orchestra underneath her vocal line. If you're an alert audience member, you recall that as being the music that was played when Valhalla was being mentioned, and that's your clue that that old man with the sword was actually none other than Wotan. I'm going to close with what I think is actually the way that the opera closes itself. If you know the story of Sleeping Beauty, Beauty was put to sleep in a castle surrounded by a forest of thorns, and only a great hero would be able to penetrate those thorns and awaken her with a kiss. We all know that, at least from Walt Disney. Well, Brunhilde's punishment is that she's to be put on a rock, stripped of her godhood, and surrounded by fire, and only a great hero, and it turns out to be Siegfried, will be able to penetrate that fire and awaken her and win her love. Now, there is a motive for fire, for the magic fire that surrounds Brunhilde. To me, it sounds like something that John Williams might have written for a magical effect in Harry Potter. This is the fire motive. And I like the way that the piccolo kind of simulates the sparks that fly up from the flames. Now, a motive can also stand for beyond just a person, place, or object. It can stand for a concept. We already heard it standing for Brunhilde's compassion, but there's another concept I'm going to briefly play for you. It's a series of 3 chords on the low brass, which is the motive of fate. Sounds like this. Now, did you notice that besides those 3 chords, what else did you hear? You also heard the magic fire music. So 2 motives were combined, fire and fate. What's happening there? That's the music that we hear as the curtain comes down. The orchestra is making commentary on the action. The orchestra is telling us and telling Wotan as he trudges away with his heart broken, never to see his daughter again, that he had no choice in this, that it could not have happened any other way, that he is no longer the ruler of his life, that this is destiny over which he has no control, that it had to happen, that Brunhilde would disobey him, and that he would have to punish her and be separated from her forever. Fire is his destiny, and separation is his destiny. Really, what much of this opera is about is a lesson that we all have to learn. in life, letting go of people sometimes, letting go of hopes and dreams. All of Wotan's dreams and plans for saving the world that he's constructed for these gods is crumbling at his feet. He wanted Siegmund to be the hero who would help restore the Ring of the Nibelung to its rightful owners. And he's realized that was foolish. It was never going to happen. He understands that the gods are doomed by the time the curtain comes down on this music drama. And everything that he loves, his son Siegmund, the home of the gods, Valhalla, and Brunhilde, the daughter who is closest to his heart, they're all being ripped away from him. He has to let go and accept what destiny has in mind. And it's all right there in the orchestra. The orchestra carries the brunt of the storytelling. And in a good production, it can leave you overwhelmed. Really empathizing with these emotions and feeling them in a way that few other opera composers can convey. That's the world of Wagner. I appreciate your listening and tuning in this afternoon. I look forward to seeing many of you listeners at the Harrison Opera House. Don't forget that I do 45 minutes before the curtain, I'll do a half-hour version of this lecture. Come up and say hello, and we'll see you at the opera.